Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Podolsky. I am the Assistant Director of the UC Institute of Transportation Studies. I'm so delighted you're able to join us today for the webinar, Policy Scenarios for Achieving Carbon Neutrality in Transportation by 2045 in California. This webinar is actually the first in our series that we're organizing, highlighting the findings from a new report, driving California's transportation emissions to zero. The report was released in April and was requested by the state legislature through the 2019 Budget Act. Specifically, the UCITS was asked to identify demand-side strategies to significantly reduce emissions from vehicles and achieve carbon neutrality in the transportation sector. Before we jump into today's webinar, I'd love to tell you some more about the UC Institute of Transportation Studies, or commonly referred to as UCITS. We are an extensive network of faculty, researcher, and administrative staff and students dedicated to advancing the state of the art in transportation engineering, planning, and policy for the people of California and the world. The UCITS was established by the state legislature in 1947 and includes branches at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Irvine, and UCLA. Some quick housekeeping before we jump in. So first, if you run into technical issues, let us know by typing into the chat box. If you have questions, there is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So please press that, a screen will pop up and you can answer, or you type in your question in there. Our speakers will also be monitoring the Q&A screen and they'll be responding to your questions live. So do not enter your questions for speakers in the chat box because they are not monitoring that and we want to make sure that they see your question. And lastly, our webinar is being recorded right now, and we will share a link with all of you in a follow-up email, and it will also be posted on the webinar's event page. Now, without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our speakers and guest respondents today. We have Lou Fulton, who has over 25 years of experience working internationally in the field of transportation, energy, and environmental analysis and policy development. He is the director of the Sustainable Transportation Energy Pathways Program, or STEPS, at ITS Davis, where he leads a range of research activities around new vehicle technologies and new fuels. He will be presenting along with Marshall Miller, who is a senior development engineer at ITS Davis, and his work focuses on advanced technologies and fuels and has developed models to assess the potential greenhouse gas reductions and cost implications from the market penetration of these innovations, both in light duty as well as the trucking sectors. Following their presentation, we'll hear from Bernadette Austin, who is the executive director for the Center for Regional Change at UC Davis, where she works to build bridges across disciplines and support research that is community engaged, policy oriented, and equity focused. She also has a background in community development, has worked with affordable housing developers, redevelopment agencies, and several nonprofits. After our presentation, we'll hear from two esteemed guest respondents that are leaders in their field. I'm so thrilled they could join us. First, we have Rajinder Sahota, who is the Deputy Executive Officer for Climate Change and Research at the California Air Resources Board. She oversees a suite of CARB's climate initiatives and programs, including the AB 32 Scoping Plan Development and Update, the economy-wide cap and trade program, the low carbon fuel standards, and much more. And we'll also hear from Roland Huang. He serves as the Managing Director of the Natural Resources Defense Council Climate and Clean Energy Program. He is a leading expert on clean vehicle technologies and has played an instrumental role in the creation and adoption of California and federal fuel efficiency standards. So we have quite a lineup. I'm very excited to have all of our speakers and our guest respondents today. So without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Lou and Marshall.
Thank you, Laura. Welcome, everybody. And great, Marshall's getting the slides up. So we will try to be efficient and go through our presentation, I think in about 20 minutes, and then turn it over to our discussants. We're part of, as Laura mentioned, we were part of a large group across several UC campuses, the 4 ITS campuses of Davis, Berkeley, Irvine, and UCLA working on this transportation study about trying to get to net neutrality, or excuse me, I should say zero emissions from the transportation sector as part of a broader net neutrality kind of objective that the state has. Yeah, go ahead, Marshall. And actually, you can skip that one. Laura mentioned that. And again, Laura kind of covered this, but I'll just mention that very specifically, we were asked to identify strategies to significantly reduce transportation-related fossil fuel demand and emissions. And it is correct that basically, if you want to get close to zero CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, you would better get close to zero in terms of fossil fuel use in any sector, including transportation sector, which is still predominantly dependent on petroleum, including actions that can be taken now and in the near future, but also thinking out to 2045 when we are targeting a zero carbon system or a near zero carbon system. So that was the goal we had. And what we'll present is sort of the overview of what we tried to do and how we achieved it in terms of some scenarios. That'll be what we focus on today. We'll also look at some of the overarching cost implications and policy implications of doing this. And then there will be a series of subsequent seminars, webinars that get into more details on specific aspects of the study. There will be one about light duty vehicles and electrification, or ZEV uptake, also including hydrogen fuel cells, one on freight, and I think we're going to have one on fuels as well. And there's also equity, jobs. All these topics are going to get picked up by webinars that are coming. So we're going to try to cover the overview here today. Next slide. And in fact, I'm going to turn it over to Marshall now to cover the next few slides.
Okay, thanks, Lou. So first, I want to just talk a little bit about kind of our methodology, how we went about thinking about this process. So in order to be at net zero by 2045, it means we need very large reductions in greenhouse gases in the next 25 years. For on-road transportation, our tools are basically behavior, which would be reduce vehicle miles traveled, drive less, essentially. Fuels reduce the fuel, what we call carbon intensity, which is the emissions per unit of energy of the fuel. And then we have vehicles. The battery electric or fuel cell vehicles can have zero emissions if the fuels are zero carbon. That would be electricity and hydrogen. So VMT can help, but it's very difficult to make huge changes in behavior. So we do include a reduction of VMT for light duty vehicles, and I'll talk a little more about that. Biomass-based liquids, basically blended with gasoline or diesel, or actually replacing gasoline or diesel, are necessary to reduce emissions from ICE vehicles. But mostly these are not zero carbon intensity, so we use them in limited amounts. We viewed the best choice for a significant reduction in greenhouse gases as zero emission vehicles, and that's battery electric or fuel cell. In order to do that, you have two requirements. You must have a very fast market penetration of these technologies due to vehicle stock turnover. Once a vehicle is purchased, it can take 10, 15 or more years before it actually leaves the fleet. So you have to get to 100% ZEB sales shares fairly quickly. The other requirement is you must have zero carbon intensity fuels. And those fuels would be electricity and hydrogen, along with the battery electric and fuel cell vehicles. So this slide shows basically sort of the results of our baseline scenario, which we call the low carbon scenario. On the left, we have CO2 emissions, and on the right, we have fuel consumption. So you can see on the left, we start at significant emissions, and it drops very sharply down to 2045 and onward. In 2045, we're actually not yet at zero. We're about 95% reduction from 2015. And the complete emissions at that time are from our biomass-based liquids that are replacements for diesel and for gasoline in ICE vehicles that are still part of the fleet, because although we've transitioned to 100% ZEB sales, we haven't transitioned to 100% ZEB stock yet. So the strategies we use are VMT reduction in light-duty vehicles, ZEB cars and trucks, and the low-carbon fuels. On the right, you see fuel consumption broken down by fuel. So you see in 2020, starting there, you have a very sharp reduction in fuel use down to 2045. And by 2045, there's only 4 fuels. The brown is hydrogen, then electricity, then biomass-based diesel, and biomass-based gasoline. So no fossil diesel, no fossil gasoline in the fleet. And aside from the low carbon scenario, we did 3 other high ZEB scenarios. So you see on the left, we have the low carbon, we call LC1, high ZEB, high fuel cell, and high liquid fuel. The next 2 columns show the time when ZEB sales hit 100% for light duty vehicles and for trucks. So you can see in the LC1, we hit 100% ZEB sales in 2040. High ZEB scenario ramps that up to 2035, 5 years faster. The high fuel cell scenario is essentially the same as the LC1, but we have many more fuel cell vehicles in the fleet than in the LC1 scenario. And finally, we have the high liquid fuel scenario where we delay the 100% ZEB sales from 2040 in the LC1 out to 2045, and for long haul trucks out to 2050. In all of these cases, by 2045, the fuels are 100% low carbon. Electricity and hydrogen have 0 emissions, 0 carbon intensity, and all the liquid fuels are biomass-based, either diesel or gasoline. The final column shows our reduction in VMT. It's the same for every scenario. 15% reduction in 2045 from what would have been in the BAU, business as usual. So this slide shows these ZEB market penetration scenarios sort of year by year from 2015 on to 2050. On the left is light duty vehicles. On the right is long haul trucks, which are slightly different from trucks in general. The orange curve is the high ZEB. You can see the very fast market penetration up to 100% ZEB sales shares by 2035. For trucks, this is going from 0 in 2020 up to 2035, 100% increase in 15 years. It's not quite that in light duty, but it's still very aggressive. The blue is the low carbon, which reaches 100% in 2040. The gray is the high biofuels, which is bumped out to 2045, or in the case of long haul trucks, out to 2050. This slide shows the actual fuel consumption by fuel type for each of our scenarios, the BAU plus the 4 advanced ZEB high penetration scenarios in 2030 and 2045. So you see in 2030, there's not a very large reduction in fuel consumption, and the fuel use is fairly similar for the different fuel types, gasoline, biomass-based fuels, and for all the others, electricity and hydrogen. By 2045, you see a fairly significant change. BAU is reduced a little bit, but not much. The 4 advanced scenarios have reductions that are quite significant. The largest reduction is the high ZEB scenario, which has the fastest market penetration for ZEBs. The high liquid fuel scenario is the lowest fuel consumption reduction of all the advanced scenarios. And if you look at the orange and the yellow, those are the biomass-based liquids. In the high liquid fuel scenario, we have about twice as much as in the high ZEB scenario in 2045. So this slide shows on the left the reduction in greenhouse gases for blue is business as usual, and yellow is our low carbon policy scenario. There is a significant reduction in modest reduction in greenhouse gases for business as usual due to 2 things. One, we do have some modest penetration of ZEBs, especially in light duty vehicles, and also all the vehicle types from 2020 out to 2045 have significant increases in fuel economy. So put those 2 together and you do see a reduction in greenhouse gases. The yellow curve shows our low carbon policy scenario, which gets to essentially 95% reduction in 2045 from 2015. The right shows a comparison between the cost of the low carbon scenario and the BAU scenario. Basically, each curve shows the difference between low carbon and the BAU. The light yellow shows the difference in vehicle costs, the dark yellow is the difference in fuel costs, and the blue is the difference in total costs. So year by year for vehicle costs, we include all vehicle purchases, the full price for the vehicle in the year that it's purchased. For fuel, we include the total cost of fuel for that year to operate the whole fleet. So you see in the vehicle costs, there's an increase. Positive values here show that the low carbon scenario is greater, costs more than the BAU scenario. There's an increase for vehicle costs starting in 2020 because initially fuel cell vehicles and battery electric vehicles cost more than conventional vehicles. So as we add more and more into the fleet, that cost difference rises. But we also are seeing a reduction in costs of these ZEB vehicles. And so by the time we get to about not quite 2035, this cost difference has turned over and is actually going negative, due primarily to light duty vehicles. The fuel costs, we see reductions right away due to the increase in fuel economy for all of the advanced vehicles. And when you put them together, you get the blue curve, which has again a rise and crosses zero around 2030. If you look at the integrated incremental cost of the LC1, low carbon scenario over BAU between 2020 and 2030, it comes out to about $10 billion. After 2030, when the LC1 is less expensive than BAU, out to 2045, we see savings of about $175 billion. Another interesting thing to note is that if you compare that incremental $10 billion to the total cost of the BAU scenario, all light duty vehicles and trucks and all fuel, that cost is around $1 trillion. So that 10 billion is roughly 0.1% of the total cost for transportation. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Lou, who will discuss details of policy.
Thanks, Marshall. So, and I see there's a lot of good questions coming in. I've tried to answer a few, but we should get into some of it during Q&A. I will say, since there's been several questions, that we did include full fuel cycle CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions on the fuel side. So of course, electric power generation emissions are included. We did not include the emissions from vehicle production or disposal, but they do matter, and we can talk about the implications of that. So what's it going to take to achieve these scenarios? I mean, it's easy to make scenarios, well, not that easy, but you know, you're creating possible futures, and the real question is, how do you get there? And so a lot of the report is about that, and it highlights both what we are already doing, which is a lot in California, but also what else we might need to do to reach these kinds of very ambitious targets and rapid change, and some of the challenges of trying to do that. So some of the things that we've already got include the previous governor's executive order to reach 5 million zero-emission vehicles, light-duty vehicles by 2030. We now have the advanced clean truck rule, which requires sales of ZEV trucks by the manufacturers up to 75% of their sales. It varies by truck type, but 75% by 2035. And actually, if you look down at the bottom one there, the latest executive order, or at least the latest among these things that Governor Newsom issued back in October, is that 100% of light-duty vehicle sales have to be ZEV by 2035. And I'm going to have to change this on the slide. Actually, it's written that all trucks, in other words, basically the stock of trucks, should be ZEV by 2045, which is roughly kind of like saying the sales of trucks should be ZEV by 2035. But so this is really challenging. In fact, when we created our LC1 scenario, we have it 100% sales for cars and trucks by 2040. And so we had already pretty much locked in that as our LC1, our low carbon scenario. So our high ZEV scenario reaches a 100% ZEB by 2035, which is what the governor's executive order calls for. And then the last, going back up a little bit, the last bullet there on the first three bullets is about the low carbon fuel standard, which has been in place for a while and requires a 20% reduction in the average fuel carbon intensity for transportation fuels between 2010 and 2030. And actually, we also did a fair bit of analysis in this study about what that might look like after 2030 if we can achieve the 20%. Actually, it'd be nice to go beyond 20% by 2030. We have to decarbonize fuels and the energy for vehicles. That's the critical part of this. And that's, I think, we're probably one of the first studies to really try to understand a low carbon fuel standard beyond 2030. Okay, next slide. So just briefly, Marshall, next slide. Briefly on a couple of these things, because I want to leave time for others. Here are some of the additional policies that were identified to achieve the light duty vehicle zero emission targets, and you can see the LC1 target there on the left. And then, of course, in the report, we're getting into some detail about what these things might look like. Some are not hard to envision, some are harder, but increasing the sales mandate to 100% ZEB sales, which has actually been done already. Use monetary and non-monetary incentives. We have monetary incentives. Non-monetary might be low emission zones or ZEB only zones where the vehicles can only enter that area if they're ZEB. It's like a ZEB exemption for a high occupancy vehicle lane. Ensuring that exported and imported vehicles are not used to circumvent ZEB policies. That's actually something that's going to really be important. Greatly expand the availability of public charging and also make sure that everyone who wants to have charging at home has some way to do that, or as many as possible. Encouraging charging at off-peak times, which depending on what part of the state you're in could mean different things. And then finally, incentivize purchase and use of ZEBs by underserved individuals and overburdened communities. And part of that has to do with where they might provide the most air quality benefits, but also related to equity and environmental justice. Next slide. I think I've covered this. This is just basically the schedule for trucks. I won't spend time on this right now. Next one. And then here are some of the measures for trucks, and I'll just pull out a few things. Of course, it's a similar type of thing of financial incentives, non-monetary incentives like priority access, but fee-bates comes up here, and fee-bates is always an interesting possibility where you're paying for your incentives by having fees, and you typically would have fees either on your most energy consuming vehicles or your sort of gas guzzler gasoline vehicles to pay for incentives on the most efficient ones. In this case, we thought, and we just describe it, we're actually doing a follow-up project to look at fee-bates in more detail, but that if you had a higher fee on a wide range of gasoline vehicles to pay for an incentive on a wide range of electric vehicles, that probably gets the job done. But you also want to take into account equity considerations there, such as the income level of people either paying or receiving in those kinds of systems. Trucks are going to need infrastructure too, and that includes charging availability and also hydrogen stations, which we don't really have for trucks at this point. Okay, I'm going to move on, and I think we're just about done. Go ahead. Oh no, this is carbon intensity. Go back. This is, we're going to probably, I think we're going to have a whole webinar on this, but the low carbon liquid fuels. I just want to say this is something that we really have to face, and a few of the questions have already asked about this. We will have a lot of liquid fuels still in the system just for cars and trucks in 2045, even in the high ZEB scenario. It'll be on the order of a few billion gallons. It could be on the order of tens of billions of gallons. Thank you, Laura. Yes, we will have a whole webinar on this topic. So if that is, eventually we should be able to phase those out. But if we need to be zero net carbon while we still have a lot of liquid fuels, then we have to phase decarbonizing those, it's either going to have to be advanced biofuels, which may never get all the way to zero, but they can probably do pretty well if they're cellulosic types of fuels, or they could be e-fuels or electricity to fuels, power to liquids type fuels. These are all very expensive options. There are a lot of controversies, at least for the biofuels, around their overall sustainability. And I think the biggest part is ramping up production capacity in the timeframes that we're talking about will be very challenging. So we actually identify this area as one of the most important and challenging parts of the whole thing. Next slide. VMT, we have a 15% reduction in vehicle travel relative to the BAU. We would love to see more than that if that works for the state and for everyone in the state. We basically managed to return the driving, as you see here, back to current levels or a little below current levels. And in that chapter, we go through a number of policies that can do that job, but it does not envision a radically different mode share, let's say, across the state. It's still going to be a car-dominated system, but more micromobility, more shared mobility, and new investments in transit systems, more transit. Okay, next. And there will also, I think, Laura, also be a webinar on that, on the VMT side? I don't know if we've planned that or not, but yes, okay. Last slide. Achieving a near zero CO2 transportation system in California will be extremely challenging. It's going to be true everywhere, but we really need to do it. A combination of strong policies will be needed. Consumers will need to be convinced, and I didn't really get into that this time in any detail, but I think that shows up in our report, especially for the electric vehicles and for the travel, that we're going to have to bring people along and get them interested in these technologies and alternative ways of traveling. But the overall cost benefit of achieving this very low carbon future looks very promising. So we showed strong net benefits even without the environmental benefits. When you bring those in, there's very clearly an overwhelming benefit picture here for this transition. So there's no reason not to do it from the point of view of the overall societal welfare that it provides. So that's it. And I guess turn back to you, Laura.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So Bernadette Austin is going to share some equity implications. Bernadette Austin was also a part of the UCITS team for the driving California's transportation emissions to zero. So Bernadette.
Great, thank you so much. And in the interest of time, I'll be able to take the questions in the Q&A, but also feel free to comment and chat, and I'll follow that after my short presentation. So thank you. My name is Bernadette Austin. I'm with UC Davis, running the Center for Regional Change. Next slide. So many of you may be familiar with this diagram. It was created by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, really highlighting that giving folks equal access to the same things does not result in equal outcomes. And so that's really where the sense of equity comes from. So that'll be a theme of the next couple of slides. So as you can see, if everyone gets the same bike, that doesn't mean that they all have the same outcomes. It doesn't fit their lived experience. The next slide. So some of you may be familiar with the concept of social determinants of health. And one of the key social determinants of health is, in fact, neighborhood and the built environment. And certainly transportation is a really significant portion of that. So we just wanted to highlight some context for why we had an equity section and what our responses were to the many great forms of research on the topics that are included in this report. So we know that social determinants of health are impacted by a couple of these issues. One is that certain communities have faced historic disinvestment from public and private sectors. So that disinvestment just means that funding and projects don't come into some of these communities. And these very same communities also face issues where undesirable or disruptive investment are happening. So there are impacts from infrastructure. An example are some of the highways that have really divided some of these communities or had other negative consequences. We also see that these same communities, most importantly, had very little opportunity or the capacity to participate in decision-making processes or to take action to improve these situations. So this is just intending to give you a little bit of a sense of where we're coming into these portions. Next slide, please. So some of our recommendations are really trifold. As we said earlier, there was a lot of disinvestment and also undesirable development that has happened in certain communities. And it can include geographic communities as well as communities with certain populations. So one of our recommendations is really to bring disproportionate benefits to disadvantaged communities first. In this sense, we're using the state of California's definition, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that term disadvantaged communities, and here the acronym is DACS. We also talk about considering reverting historically damaging projects, such as highways that have divided communities, to really increase some of these equity components. So that first and third recommendation really go together. And third, but certainly the most important, is to prioritize input from affected residents and communities. And this is really seeking to address this history of lack of opportunity and lack of capacity to participate in decision making. Next slide, please. So as we've indicated, you can look at the report itself or some of the executive summary recommendations to learn more about each of these. And we do have forthcoming topics, but I'm just going to try and really hit some highlights, and then we'll hear from our respondents. So when it comes to light duty vehicles, some of the recommendations include supporting incentives that target lower income or low wealth buyers. Also, as this has come up in some of the Q&A, ensuring deployment of charging infrastructure, particularly in multi-unit dwellings. When we're looking more at some of the heavy duty vehicles, prioritizing EV deployment in areas that are disadvantaged. For VMTs, we look at prioritizing policies that really increases the accessibility, but also avoids displacement. So that's a really key piece. We also look at supporting transit and other low carbon services and modes in these disadvantaged communities. And with respect to fuels, we really recommend avoiding the siting of fuel production facilities in these disadvantaged communities, and also carefully monitoring local pollutants. So it's really just a high level summary. Next slide. I'm happy to address questions in the Q&A section or the comment section. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bernadette. So I am pleased to turn to our guest respondents to hear their reaction. So first, I'd like to turn to you, Rajinder, to provide your perspective in reaction to the speakers' presentations today.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you, Lou, Bernadette, and Marshall for the presentation. There are a couple of themes that you touched on that are going to be near and dear to my work, because at the Air Board, we just kicked off the process to update the AB 32 scoping plan, which is going to be setting a path for how we have an economy-wide path to hit carbon neutrality by mid-century. So not just transportation, but the entire economy for the state of California. Transportation is about 50% of the state's emissions. 41% are coming from the tailpipes, and about 10% are coming from the oil extraction and refining activities in the state. Transportation is also the predominant contribution for diesel PM throughout the state, and especially in communities located next to distribution centers, ports, and freeways. So it is an equity issue when we think about transportation. A couple of things that I wanted to touch on was, we also got an executive order, or not executive order, but direction from the governor during Earth Week that as part of our scoping plan, we need to evaluate a path to phase out extraction activities in the state of California. So if we have fuels that are still needed in the economy and they are petroleum based, we would end up in a situation where potentially we have no extraction from local resources, but we're now importing in fuel for use for that fleet that remains in the system in 2045. And that could mean another equity issue, because it could mean more activity at ports, it could be more fuel brought in by rail, it could be more fuel brought in by trucks. So that is something that we have been trying to highlight, that if we're going to be serious about phasing out extraction in the state of California, we need to be pairing that with reducing demand for that fuel. Otherwise, we have this potential odd outcome where we are creating other equity related problems for bringing fuel in if we're not going to produce it ourselves. Another thing that keeps coming up is VMT versus technology. And at the state level, we are very limited in what we can do on local land use decisions. We are very limited in what we can do on citywide pricing, congestion pricing, all those pieces. That authority rests at the state level, or at the city level, local government levels throughout the state. Where we have, as the state focused, is on technology, vehicle standards, fuel standards, et cetera. And so that tension between how much can we push on technology, how much can we push on fuel standards, is going to be facing how much can we reduce VMT when the state doesn't really have anything that allows us to go in and regulate VMT when that authority rests somewhere else. One more thing that I want to comment on VMT is that it is behavior-based. And as the state, we have always been reluctant to talk about people having to change their behavior because nobody likes government telling them what to do. So how do we successfully get people to want to not drive and want to take alternative modes? That is going to be one of the challenges as well when we think about VMT. And then I want to talk lastly about infrastructure. So I took to heart the point that Bernadette made in her last slide about citing for infrastructure and knowing where the communities are. That is an absolutely fair point. I think the struggle for us is that we have programs at the state right now that existing petroleum refiners are looking at, and they are considering retooling those refineries in the state of California, where they're located now, to produce sustainable aviation fuels, to produce biofuels, renewable diesel, so that we don't have to use petroleum-based fuels. But that means those facilities, those existing assets, stay where they are. They just produce a different product, a product that we want them to produce. But we are being met with opposition at the local level because at the local level, we have environmental groups and we have EJ advocates that would like to see those facilities just not operate and be mothballed. And so I guess the question then for us is, and not just ARB, but all of us collectively, is the answer to actually try and retool those existing assets and use those? Or is it really to try and build new assets, and who's going to pay for it and how quickly can we do it? Because what we've also learned from the modeling that UC Davis has done and the modeling that we've done is if we don't lay down a solid foundation of change in this decade, we will not be on track to hit our carbon neutrality targets by mid-century. And so all of the things that were noted in the presentation, all of those questions that are coming up in the context of the study, they are playing out right now in the real world. And they are going to continue to play out. And if we don't find a way to navigate them, we are not going to be on the path to hit carbon neutrality. We are not going to be on a path to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels in the transportation sector, which means we also don't get those badly needed air quality benefits in the disadvantaged communities. So really appreciate the discussion today and the presentation. It's so timely, and I very much value the interactions that we as ARB and some of the state agencies have been able to have with ITS and UC Davis, because as you were working on the studies, we were picking your brains along the way or pointing things out along the way, like here's the constraints we have to work in. And so really appreciate that relationship was built in the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajinder. We could have a whole webinar just on your comments and probably multiple just on this presentation. There's so much to dig into. I was taking notes and hopefully we can get into some of those in the Q&A. So I'd like to shift to Roland Wang. He is again with the Natural Resources Defense Council and a leading expert around vehicle electrification. So Roland.
Thank you, Laura. And congratulations also to Marshall, Lou, and Bernadette for an excellent study. It's an amazing comprehensive study, and it has a lot of very powerful information in it. And I want to focus in on some of my thoughts, which are very much with what Rajinder said as well. So I don't think there should be any huge surprises. I mean, obviously, to reinforce what Lou said, the study shows that this can be done. We can get very, very, very close to a zero-emission transportation system by 2045. And furthermore, the benefits far exceed the cost. The benefits in private fuel cost savings alone, 177 billion versus the 10 billion in cost, $28 billion in 2045 alone in health costs. And that just doesn't even count the social cost of carbon. So the benefits are overwhelming. And to Rajinder's point, mobile sources are a big part of both our greenhouse gas problem, 40% when you look at on-road and off-road, but it's also 80% of our nitrogen oxide emissions. Therefore, we cannot solve our climate problems. We cannot solve our health problems. We cannot clean up pollution in disadvantaged, highly impacted communities without tackling transportation. And essentially, we have to move to electrification of our on-road and off-road sources. Electrification, frankly, is the backbone of our net decarbonization strategy. It both gives us that zero emission greenhouse gas, but also equally important, gives us that zero emission criteria pollutants, zeroing out the NOx, zeroing out the particles. This is not to diminish the importance of VMT, and I think Rajinder pointed out very well how challenging VMT reductions are, especially for state policy. VMT policy, reduction policy, is incredibly important. We need to create a transportation system that's cleaner, more affordable, more equitable, and make our cities more livable. But electrification is a backbone of this decarbonization strategy. And furthermore, the next 2 years are really, really critical for us to really strengthen and adopt new policies, strengthen existing policies and adopt new policies. The next 2 years, we have a window here in California where there are critical programs which need to be strengthened or adopted. At the federal level, we also have an opportunity in a window to create a real strong partner, both when you see the Biden administration's commitment to strengthening vehicle standards, which will also help California, but as well as their commitment to investing in infrastructure, including in EV charging infrastructure. Next 2 years, very critical for us to hit that inflection point for this zero emission vehicle market. California was a leader. California is now 13th in the world, give or take, in terms of sales percentage of zero emission vehicles. We've slipped behind many of the European countries. They've gone faster. China obviously is rapidly building out its electric vehicle industry. California can and should and needs to do better. So very quickly, in terms of this next 2 years and the critical policies that we see as on the platter in front of the state of California, especially the state, where we see the need to step up. It's going to be, again, on strengthening of standards, and it's going to be on adopting programs and investments in incentives and infrastructure. So first, on standards, Lou mentioned a lot of the vehicle standards, also the low carbon fuel standard, very important. But then over the next year to year and a half, California, the Air Board specifically, has the opportunity to strengthen the standards for the light duty vehicle as well as for the medium and heavy duty vehicle through something called the Advanced Clean Truck and Advanced Clean Fleet rules. For the light duty, of course, is the zero emission vehicle program, sometimes called the Advanced Clean Car 2 program. Next year, year and a half, critical windows, because these standards need to be extended and or strengthened in order for the standards to be consistent with the decarbonization goals of the ZEB that require the rapid ramp up of ZEB Sales, which Lou showed in one of the slides. The second thing is that infrastructure. We know we are far behind in infrastructure. The recent Energy Commission study shows we need about 1.2 public or shared charging stations by 2030. We're at somewhere around, by 2025, we're estimating about a couple 100,000. We need to do more infrastructure. One of the things we need to do better is the California PUC needs to speed up and accelerate the process of approving infrastructure programs from utilities. We can't do it without the utilities. They know the system, they're on the ground. Finally, the California legislator and governor needs to adopt additional public investments. We need to get through that initial investment hump, which we need to get to in order to see all these benefits start to accrue. California legislature currently is looking at $3.9 billion multi-year investment in ZEV, which is great, infrastructure and incentives for zero-emission vehicles. But to Bernadette's point, we need to make sure those investments work for all Californians, including and especially those in disadvantaged communities. They need to see those benefits. That's why there's some unfinished business currently in the California legislature where there's need to be more trailer bills and other policy bills to make sure that $3.9 billion is prioritized in a manner where we know the disadvantaged communities will see benefits of the zero emission vehicle transformation. They should be prioritized to see those benefits. Those are my thoughts. In sum, an excellent study, a lot of work ahead of us. California is on the cutting edge, and I think the next 2 years will be very, very critical. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Roland and Rajinder. I just remind everyone to type questions into the Q&A, and we'll be addressing some of those live. Our speakers are already responding to some of them too, so click on the answered tab and you'll see a lot of discussion and responses in there. So I know one question that came up that the attendees would like to revisit was including the life cycle emissions from manufacturing when talking about ZEBs. And Lou and Marshall, you promised that we could revisit that. So I'm curious if the two of you could comment on including those emissions.
Yeah, and we might want to get a little help from Roland and Rajinder on this too, but I just off the top of my head don't remember exactly. I mean, the scope of the study is California emissions. So if vehicles are produced outside the state, we're not including them, although we do talk about it. And we note that, this is vehicle production is a critical part of the picture and disposal as well. There is a fair bit of research now that shows that batteries are somewhat of an issue to produce, although I think there's lots of reasons to think that will get better, just like a lot of industrial emissions will improve, and a lot of it depends where you make them. But there's no reason to think that in some way changes the fundamental results of this strong, basically entire shift to zero tailpipe emission vehicles being somehow compromised by vehicle production emissions. I don't know, Roland, you lit up your camera. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure thing. I do want to mention, because this issue does come up and is closely related issue, is battery recycling issues. I do believe that this is by necessity going to be an issue that will happen. That large-scale recycling of batteries will occur. You can see some of the life cycle responsibility requirements in Europe happening. When you look at the resource needs in terms of the scale up, recycling will happen. But it's not to say that it will happen at the pace we want it to and as fast as we want it to domestically. So I think that there will be more attention being paid attention to this issue. I believe CARB is actually starting that process where they're proposing in the Advanced Clean Car 2 rule to require labeling of batteries for their recyclability. I believe that's the case. I think that's kind of the starting of it. I think it's coming. I think we need to address it to make sure we do address that full life cycle aspect.
Hi, this is Rajinder. I just want to jump in on this question because I think there's embedded in this a GHG accounting question, not just a recycling of the battery question. So the way that California's targets for climate are structured is they're focused on all the emissions within our geographic boundary, because for international accounting and for national accounting, you take ownership of all the emissions that happen within your geographic region. And so when goods are brought into the state of California, the other regions where those goods are produced and there were direct emissions, those are already accounted there. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be mindful of the embedded carbon. It really is about what we can control and what's within our jurisdiction as state regulators. The one place that the two places that we do exceed our state boundaries is first electricity. We're a huge consumer of electricity in California. So we do account for emissions associated with electricity imported into the state. That's in statute that we are required to do that. In our low carbon fuel standard, and as consistent with the reports here, we have life cycle accounting for our fuels. And that is by design, because then you have multiple opportunities along that supply chain to think about process changes or feedstock changes to reduce the final embedded carbon intensity of that fuel. But when it comes to accounting for emissions from fuel in the state of California, it's the tailpipe emissions that are counted, and it's the refinery and extraction emissions and facility emissions within the state of California. And so there is a very bureaucratic and just avoiding double counting rationale for how the inventory is structured. There has been increased interest in trying to do life cycle. I've seen things where if a company does more than $100 million worth of business in California, they would have to do a life cycle declaration of all of the carbon intensity of every product. Imagine how many carbon intensities we would be doing for everything Amazon ships into California. And so there's a practical nature of it, and then there's the regulatory jurisdictional nature of it.
Great, thank you, Rajinder. Something else that came up in the Q&A, and I think Lou or Marshall, you responded to it, but it was talking about those hard to electrify sectors. So marine, aviation, what do we do with those?
Yeah,
yeah.
And I was thinking about that exact, there are 2 or 3 questions related to that. So first of all, we only included in these accounting scenarios the in-state travel, so both passenger and freight for aviation and shipping, so no ocean going shipping. But we acknowledge that those are pretty major sectors. And if you look at ships that leave here headed out internationally, and planes that leave headed out internationally, to many times the emissions of what happens in state. And we collectively, California, US, and the world have to grapple with this, and those have to also go to zero, as soon as possible. Certainly, I think they're going to be tough. They're going to be tough because, especially aviation, we still don't have any really obvious pathways to a non-liquid fuel propulsion system for major aircraft, commercial aircraft that go more than a couple hundred miles. We may get there somehow or other, or we may find a zero carbon fuel that can do it. But it'll probably be advanced biofuels. That's certainly what the aviation industry is counting on, and I think the shipping industry too. And eventually maybe these e-fuels, electrofuels that are truly zero carbon, but likely to be very expensive. The only thing to say at this point is that when we look at the in-state of those, along with the road vehicles, like I said, it's a problem. You've got a lot of liquid fuels left in 2045, but it's on the order of 4, 5, 6 billion gallons. When you look at that same set of numbers at the US level, when even again, if it's not international, but just domestically within the US, you're looking at 50 billion, or between 50 and 75 billion gallons that you might have. That's our sort of the back of the envelope we have at the national level. Suddenly this is really big numbers. And if you then take it to the world, it's going to become, as we hopefully solve the road-based transportation emissions problem, it's going to become really the core of where we have to put a lot of attention in the coming decade.
Roland and Rajinder, do you have any comments on this question, or we can move to the next? We are getting to the top of our hour. However, I did want to ask all our speakers and guest respondents to say something about vehicle miles traveled. So that is one of the hardest areas and strategies. One, Rajinder has said the state doesn't really have authority. This is a local government. It's very behavior driven. So we also heard by Rajinder Roland that we have this window to act, and it is very near and it is closing. So around VMT, what can we do in the near term, in the next 2 years, the next 10 years, to really make a change there and get us on track? And I would love to hear everybody's comments and as we close out this webinar.
So I can share an observation. There was some silver lining coming out of the VMT numbers around telework and the pandemic, that we had made a big shift in driving patterns. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We, as the state, are still at majority telework, and we know that VMT levels are almost back to pre-pandemic levels. And we're seeing data that says telework actually allows for more discretionary trips during the day. And so the signals are not there that the things we thought would help, like expansive telework would help, those are not bearing out in what we're seeing as the actual patterns in reality right now. I think there's also been a hurdle that's been placed when it comes to mass transit. The pandemic, the ability for it to spread, has definitely moved people away from wanting to use mass transit. So there's going to remain a challenge there. But I do think that for travel within cities, I do think that the mobility options out there, the jump bikes, the scooters, all of those are being embraced, and they're being embraced by, you know, folks who are probably 10 years or 15 years younger than me at a scale that is not being embraced by my generation. And that's good, because that's where we need to go. But I think that there are new things we've learned from the pandemic around the VMT, and we're still digesting some of that. And it clearly put away some of the things that we thought would happen with VMT patterns with people shifting to telework.
Great, Roland, I see that you popped up, and then
Yeah, give Roland, over to you, Roland, then I'll say something.
Maybe Lou will have the silver bullet here. I do think this is a very, very challenging problem, and I think we've seen the trends, and I think the whole situation with COVID and more remote working also throws in a lot of challenging questions. I will say that one of the levers we're trying to pull is trying to make sure that financing, transportation infrastructure financing, is aligned with greenhouse gas goals. That's something we're working both here in the state of California. We're also working on it federally, where federal transportation dollars should be tied to meeting or demonstrating that they're actually going to be not increasing, but preferably even decreasing VMT and emissions. Obviously, you might imagine transportation infrastructure funding is a super complex, super political environment to work in. But that is one of the levers, I think one of the necessary levers which has to be pulled, is just aligning the financing with the greenhouse gas goals.
we are at the top of the hour, but Lou, if you have closing.
Oh, so I'll just do the quick one, which is tune in for the VMT webinar, because I think that will be where we get into some detail and can try to really properly address these questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that plug. I know there are a lot of questions. We didn't quite get to them. I apologize. A lot of them are about VMT. We will tackle those. We're working to pin down a date right now in mid-August. For everyone who registered, you will get an announcement when we have pinned down that date. So at this time, I'd just like to thank all of you that joined us today for spending your hour with us. I'd also like to thank our speakers today, Lou Fulton, Marshall Miller, Bernadette Austin, thank you so much. And our guest respondents, a special thanks to Rajinder Sahota and Roland Wong. Thank you so much for your comments. And if you can, there's a link there in our evaluation survey. Please let us know how we did. Tell us how we can improve. We read your responses. And with that, thank you for joining us today. And that concludes our webinar.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks so much.